Death didn't walk into the Waldorf Astoria that night. It took the elevator. October 15th, 1935, high above Manhattan on the 39th floor, where the city's hunger and despair couldn't climb, 12 men gathered in a room where time, law, and mercy had all been quietly suffocated. Outside, the Great Depression was eating the country alive. Bread lines wrapped around city blocks. Men who used to run banks were selling apples on street corners. The air in New York City smelled of coal smoke, desperate sweat, and exhaust. But up here, in the private suite of Charles Lucky Luciano, the air smelled of lavender, polished mahogany, and $50 Cuban cigars. It was a fortress of silence, soundproofed walls, thick velvet curtains drawn tight against the world. Inside this room sat 12 men who, collectively, possessed a GDP higher than most small European nations. They were the board of directors for the syndicate, the Commission, a body of men who had sworn to leave the chaos of the streets behind and embrace the order of the boardroom. But on this specific night, the chaos had found its way in. At the far end of the long conference table stood a man who didn't fit the decor. His suit was expensive, but it looked cheap on him. His tie was crooked. His hair was a mess of grease and nervous energy. Arthur Flagenheimer, known to the world and the police blotters as Dutch Schultz, was vibrating. You could almost hear the hum of adrenaline radiating off him. He was a man who had built an empire on beer and blood in the Bronx, a man who solved problems with a lead pipe and a shallow grave. And right now, he was looking at the end of his world. He wasn't looking at a judge. He wasn't looking at a cop. He was looking at his peers, and they were looking back at him with eyes that were terrifyingly empty. For the last 2 hours, Dutch Schultz had been pleading his case. He had been begging the commission for permission to kill Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor, who was systematically tearing his organization apart. Dutch had shouted. He had slammed his fist on the table. He had laid out the logistics of the hit, how they would catch Dewey coming out of his office, how they would use a silencer, how it would be clean. Lucky Luciano, sitting at the head of the table, hadn't said a word. He had just smoked, the ember of his cigar glowing bright in the dim light. Luciano was the anti-Schultz. Where Dutch was fire and noise, Luciano was ice and calculus. When Dutch finally ran out of breath, Luciano didn't argue. He simply leaned forward, crushed his cigar into the crystal ashtray, and called for a vote. That was the new world order. No more wars, no more vendettas. Just a show of hands. One by one, the hands went up. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis. 11 hands rose into the smoky air. 11 votes for no. The commission would not authorize the murder of a federal official. They would not risk their billion-dollar enterprise to save one sloppy boss from a tax evasion charge. Dutch Schultz stared at those hands. To him, they didn't look like votes. They looked like daggers. He blinked, the reality of the betrayal crashing into him like a freight train. In his mind, he wasn't looking at businessmen making a risk assessment. He was looking at traitors. The silence that followed the vote was so absolute, it made your ears ring. It was the sound of a power shift. The tectonic plates of the underworld were grinding together. And then, Dutch Schultz broke the one rule that held the entire system together. He didn't storm out. He didn't scream. He reached inside his double-breasted jacket. The sound of the fabric rustling was the loudest thing in the room. When his hand came back out, it was gripping the heavy cold steel of a .45 caliber automatic. The slide racked back with a mechanical clack-clack that echoed off the expensive wallpaper. Dutch leveled the weapon, the black bore of the gun, stared unblinking at the center of Lucky Luciano's forehead. "You soft Italian pimp," Dutch whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You think a vote stops me?" The room froze. This was the nightmare scenario. The feral dog had been led into the parlor. In that fraction of a second, every man at the table had to make a choice. Reach for their own pieces, dive for the floor, or wait to see whose brains would paint the wall behind them. But Lucky Luciano didn't move. He didn't even blink. He sat comfortably in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, staring down the barrel of the gun as if it were a boring piece of paperwork. He looked at Dutch not with fear, but with a profound, almost tragic pity. Luciano knew something that Dutch was too angry to understand. He knew that power didn't come from the gun in your hand. It came from the men who obeyed you. And in that moment, as Dutch's finger tightened on the trigger, he wasn't displaying power. He was displaying weakness. He was showing the commission that he was a liability, a wild animal that could no longer be housebroken. The trigger didn't click. The hammer didn't fall. The explosion never came. But the death of Dutch Schultz happened right then and there. The moment that gun cleared its holster, the decision was made. It wasn't written down. It wasn't spoken aloud. It was communicated in the glances exchanged between the other 11 men at the table. Dutch thought he was threatening the chairman of the board. In reality, he was signing his own death certificate. This is the story of that signature. This is the story of how the Mafia grew up. It's the story of how a gang of immigrants with switchblades became a shadow government that ran America. And it all started with a gun that was never fired in a room full of men who had forgotten how to be afraid. You are listening to the Untold Mob Chronicles. This isn't the movie version. This is the autopsy of the American underworld. Hit subscribe, because we are about to open the files on the 8 days that changed organized crime forever. At that moment, gun drawn, adrenaline pumping, would you have pulled the trigger if you were Dutch? Or was he doomed the second he touched the weapon? If you want to see how the mob turned from a gang into a government, hit that subscribe button. We're exposing the history the movies left out. To understand why a man like Dutch Schultz, a man who had survived the beer wars of the Prohibition, a man who had stacked bodies like firewood in the back alleys of the Bronx, would break the sacred code of the Commission, you have to understand the ghost that was haunting him. You have to look past the gun in his hand and see the shadow standing behind him. That shadow had a name: Thomas Edmund Dewey. In the history of the American underworld, there had always been a rhythm to the game of cops and robbers. It was a dance. The police were a cost of doing business, like electricity or rent. You paid the beat cop to look the other way. You paid the sergeant to lose the evidence. You paid the judge to suspend the sentence. For 50 years, the machinery of New York justice was lubricated by graft. It was a system that men like Dutch Schultz understood perfectly. It was transactional. But Thomas Dewey broke the machine. Dewey wasn't a cop. He was a special prosecutor appointed by the governor, and he didn't look like a threat. He was 33 years old, short, fastidious, with a mustache that looked like it had been drawn on with a ruler. He looked like a choir boy or librarian. But inside the courtrooms of Manhattan, Thomas Dewey was a predator. He represented something the old-school mobsters couldn't wrap their heads around: the incorruptible state. He didn't want their money. He didn't want their favors. He wanted their scalps. By 1935, Dewey had launched a crusade that felt less like a legal investigation and more like a military siege. He wasn't kicking down doors and cracking skulls. That was the old way. Dewey was using a weapon far deadlier than a Thompson submachine gun. He was using mathematics. He was using the tax code. He was using the telephone wiretap. Dutch Schultz was the beer baron, but his real wealth came from the numbers racket in Harlem, an illegal lottery played by thousands of poor residents every day. It was a river of nickels and dimes that flowed into an ocean of millions. It was a cash business, untraceable, or so Dutch thought. But Dewey was meticulously reconstructing the flow of money. He was turning Dutch's own greed into a noose. Imagine the psychological pressure cooker inside Dutch Schultz's skull. For months, he watched Dewey dismantle his empire, brick by brick. He saw his lieutenants get subpoenaed. He saw his bankers flip. He saw the walls of his immunity crumbling. Dutch was a man of violence. When someone stole from him, he killed them. When someone disrespected him, he killed them. Violence was his hammer, and for 20 years, every problem looked like a nail. But you can't shoot a subpoena. You can't intimidate a tax audit. Dutch was punching at smoke. He was fighting an enemy he couldn't touch, and it was driving him insane. The indictment was coming. Everyone knew it. Tax evasion. It sounded boring, but the sentence was 20 years. For a man like Dutch, who was 43 years old and accustomed to the finest silk sheets and the wildest nights in the city. 20 years in a federal penitentiary wasn't a sentence. It was a burial. He would go in a king and come out an old, forgotten man. This is where the schism formed. This is where the tectonic plates of the underworld began to pull apart. On one side, you had Dutch Schultz, the last of the mustache Petes, even if he didn't have the mustache. He represented the chaos of the Prohibition era. To him, the solution was obvious. If Thomas Dewey is the problem, you kill Thomas Dewey. You put a bullet in his head, the investigation stops, and everyone goes back to making money. It was simple. It was brutal. It was street logic. On the other side, you had Lucky Luciano. Luciano looked at the same problem and saw a completely different reality. Luciano was the first CEO of crime. He understood that the Mafia had evolved. They weren't just a gang anymore. They were a part of the American fabric. They owned unions. They owned trucking companies. They owned politicians. Luciano looked at Thomas Dewey and didn't see a man. He saw an institution. He realized that Dewey was a symbol of the United States government. If the mob assassinated a high-profile federal prosecutor in the streets of New York, the government wouldn't just shrug and move on. They would declare war. The FBI would descend on New York like a plague of locusts. The public outcry would demand blood. The politicians they had in their pockets would be forced to turn against them to save their own careers. To Luciano, killing Dewey was suicide. It was burning down your own house to kill a spider. But Dutch couldn't see the house, he only saw the spider. This was the friction in the room at the Waldorf Astoria. It wasn't just an argument about a hit, it was a collision of centuries. It was the 19th century bandit facing off against the 20th century executive. Dutch Schultz believed that he was bigger than the law. Lucky Luciano knew that the only way to survive the law was to hide within it, to be quiet, to be invisible. Dutch was loud, he was flashy, he gave interviews to the press where he mocked the police. He wore his notoriety like a badge of honor. He didn't understand that in the new world Luciano had built, fame was fatal. So when Dutch Schultz stood up in that boardroom, surrounded by smoke and silence, he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for a way of life that was already dead. He was a dinosaur screaming at the meteor. He genuinely believed that if he could just bully these men, if he could just wave his gun and scream loud enough, they would see it his way. He thought he could force them to join his war. He didn't realize that by threatening the chairman of the board, he wasn't proving his strength. He was proving that he was the most dangerous thing in the world to a criminal organization. He was unpredictable. The unstoppable force wasn't Thomas Dewey. It wasn't the FBI. It was the evolution of business. And Dutch Schultz was standing squarely on the tracks. Who was the bigger threat to the mob's survival in 1935? The relentless prosecutor Thomas Dewey or the reckless ego of Dutch Schultz? Let me know who you think was the real danger. We are documenting every major power shift in underworld history. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next investigation. The air in Suite 39C had turned poisonous. For 3 hours, the arguments had circled the table like sharks. Dutch Schultz had used every weapon in his arsenal. He had pleaded, he had bullied, he had invoked the old codes of loyalty and omerta. He stood before the commission, his face slick with sweat, his voice hoarse, painting a picture of a world without Thomas Dewey. He promised them that one bullet would solve everything. He promised that if they let him off the leash, the problem would disappear by morning. But the men staring back at him weren't listening to the promise. They were calculating the risk. Lucky Luciano sat at the head of the table, a portrait of stone-faced indifference. To his right sat Meyer Lansky, the mob's accountant, a man who could kill you with a decimal point. To his left, Frank Costello, the diplomat who kept the judges and politicians on the payroll. These men didn't think in terms of honor or revenge. They thought in terms of return on investment. And the investment Dutch was proposing, assassinating a special prosecutor, had a negative yield. It was bad business. Luciano finally cut through the noise. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated, with the flat effect of a man reading a grocery list, that the murder of Thomas Dewey was forbidden. He explained that Dewey was a national figure. If he died violently, the federal government would turn New York City upside down. Every racket, every gambling den, every union kickback scheme would be exposed. The heat would melt the entire infrastructure they had spent 4 years building. "It is not happening, Dutch," Luciano said. "We are businessmen. We don't kill the law. We buy it. And if we can't buy it, we wait it out." Dutch looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. Wait it out? Dutch didn't have time. The clock was ticking. The indictment was days away. Then came the humiliation. Luciano called for the vote. It was a piece of theater designed to crush Dutch's ego. In the old days, the boss of bosses simply gave an order, but Luciano wanted Dutch to see the isolation. He wanted him to see the math. "All in favor of the hit?" Luciano asked. Dutch's hand shot up. It hung there in the air, trembling slightly, a solitary flag on a battlefield he had already lost. He looked around the table, eyes darting from face to face. Genovese, Anastasia, Bonanno. He waited for a second hand to rise. He waited for just one ally, one other man who still had the stomach for the old ways. Nobody moved. 11 men sat with their hands on the table. 11 pairs of eyes looked anywhere but at Dutch. "The motion fails," Luciano said, 11-1. That was the moment the levees broke. The rejection was total. It wasn't just a no, it was an excommunication from reality. Dutch Schultz, the man who had ruled the Bronx with terror, had just been outvoted by a committee. This is when the gun came out. We touched on this moment earlier, but let's slow it down. Let's look at the anatomy of this mistake. When Dutch drew that .45 automatic and aimed it at Luciano, he wasn't trying to kill him. If Dutch wanted Luciano dead, he would have fired immediately. No, the gun was a gavel. Dutch was trying to veto the vote with violence. He was screaming that he was still a boss, that he still had the power of life and death. "You think you can vote on my life?" Dutch snarled, the gun shaking in his grip. "I built this. I earned this." The room went into that terrible vacuum-sealed silence. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner of Murder, Inc., tensed in his chair, his hand inching toward his own jacket. But Luciano stopped him with a microscopic shake of his head. Luciano knew that if a firefight broke out in the Waldorf Astoria, it was over. The police would come, the press would come, the myth of the respectable businessman would be shattered. So Luciano played the most dangerous game of poker in history. He bet his life on Dutch's cowardice. He stared down the barrel and spoke to Dutch not as an enemy, but as a disappointed father. He told Dutch that if he pulled that trigger, he would have to kill everyone in the room. And even if he managed that miracle, he would walk out of that hotel into a world where every soldier and every family was hunting him. "You can kill me, Dutch," Luciano said, "but you can't kill the commission." The logic pierced through the rage. Dutch Schultz stood there, frozen, the gun growing heavier by the second. He realized with a sickening clarity that Luciano was right. The system was bigger than the man. The gun was useless against the organization. Slowly, painfully, Dutch lowered the weapon. He didn't put it away. He just let it hang by his side, a symbol of his impotence. He muttered something about doing it his own way, about not needing their permission. He turned and walked out of the suite, slamming the door behind him. Dutch Schultz left the Waldorf Astoria that night believing he had walked away from a stalemate. He believed that by not firing, he had bought himself time. He believed that he could still go rogue, kill Dewey on his own, and present the commission with a fait accompli. He thought he was still a player in the game. He was wrong. The meeting in Suite 39C didn't end when Dutch left. In fact, the real meeting hadn't even started yet. The moment the door clicked shut, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The tension evaporated, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. There was no celebration. There was no sigh of relief. There was only business. Lucky Luciano lit a fresh cigar. He looked around the table at the 11 men who remained. The silence now wasn't heavy. It was efficient. "He's going to do it anyway," Meyer Lansky said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. They all knew Dutch. They knew his ego couldn't handle the defeat. They knew he was crazy enough to try to kill Dewey despite the vote, and if Dutch killed Dewey, the commission would burn. Dutch was a liability, a cancer. And when you have cancer, you cut it out. Luciano didn't have to scream. He didn't have to pull a gun. He simply looked at Albert Anastasia, the man who ran the enforcement arm of the syndicate, the group the press called Murder, Inc. "Take care of it," Luciano said. That was it. 4 words. No drama, no speeches, just an executive order issued in a quiet room. While Dutch Schultz was storming through the lobby of the Waldorf, ranting to his bodyguards, making plans to assassinate a federal prosecutor, his fate had already been sealed upstairs. He was a dead man walking. The calendar said he had 8 days left to live, but in the eyes of the commission, he was already a ghost. This is the ruthlessness of the corporate mob. They didn't kill Dutch because they hated him. They didn't kill him because he pulled a gun on Luciano. That was just theatrics. They killed him because he was bad for business. He was a variable that couldn't be controlled. And in the world Lucky Luciano built, control was the only currency that mattered. Luciano let Dutch leave the room alive only to order his death minutes later. Was this a masterstroke of strategy or a cowardly move? Did Dutch deserve a face-to-face warning? Hit that like button if you think the commission made the right call, and subscribe if you want to know what happened to the men who voted yes. 8 days. That is how long Dutch Schultz lasted after he walked out of the Waldorf Astoria. 8 days of paranoia, 8 days of looking over his shoulder, checking shadows, and planning a murder that would never happen. He fled New York. He crossed the river into New Jersey, setting up his temporary headquarters in the back room of the Palace Chop House in Newark. If the Waldorf Astoria was the boardroom of the new mafia, the Palace Chop House was the grave of the old one. It was a dive. It smelled of fried onions, stale beer, and cheap floor wax. It was the kind of place where men went to hide, not to rule. On the night of October 23, 1935, Dutch was sitting at a table in the IA's back, going over a ledger. He was surrounded by his inner circle, his accountant, his bodyguard, his enforcer. They were counting numbers. They were drinking beer. They were trying to pretend that the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. Around 10:15 p.m., Dutch stood up. He left his bodyguards at the table and walked toward the men's room. He was unarmed. He was unescorted. For a man who had spent his life surviving gang wars, it was a fatal lapse in judgment, or maybe deep down, he just wanted it to be over. While Dutch was staring into the rusted mirror of a dive bar bathroom, washing the ink of the ledger off his hands, the front door of the restaurant swung open. 2 men walked in. Charles, the Bug Workman, and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss. They weren't bosses. They weren't legends. They were mechanics. They were the blue-collar employees of Murder, Inc., sent to perform a corporate restructuring. The violence that followed wasn't cinematic. It was messy, loud, and terrifying. Weiss opened fire on the bodyguards at the table with a shotgun and a .38 revolver. The air filled with smoke and the screams of patrons diving under tables. But Workman walked past the chaos. He had a specific work order. He walked straight to the bathroom door and kicked it open. Dutch Schultz turned around. He didn't have his .45. He didn't have his army. He just had wet hands and a look of sudden, terrible realization. Workman fired once. The bullet, a .45 caliber slug, the same caliber Dutch had pointed at Lucky Luciano 8 days earlier, tore through Dutch's abdomen. It was a gut shot. A rusty bullet, according to legend, designed to cause infection if the impact didn't kill him. Dutch collapsed onto the dirty tile floor next to the urinal. The beer baron of the Bronx, the man who defied the commission, was left bleeding out on the cold porcelain of a public bathroom in New Jersey. The hitmen fled. They vanished into the night, their job done, their time card punched. But Dutch didn't die immediately. And this is the part of the story that haunts the history books. He lingered for 22 hours in a hospital bed, burning with a fever of 106 degrees. Police stenographers sat by his bedside, pens hovering, waiting for him to name his killer. They wanted a confession. They wanted him to rat out the commission. But Dutch Schultz didn't give them names. His brain, cooked by fever and morphine, dissolved into poetry. He rambled for hours, speaking in a surreal, broken stream of consciousness that scholars are still trying to decipher. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 kim. Mother's the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast. French-Canadian bean soup. They were the last words of a dying breed, the chaotic, nonsensical rambling of a man whose era had ended. When he finally flatlined, the secrets of the commission died with him. So, what is the lesson here? Why do we still talk about the night Dutch pulled a gun on Lucky? It's because that moment was the fulcrum of history. Thomas Dewey, the man Dutch wanted to kill, lived. He didn't just live. He thrived. He became the governor of New York. He ran for president of the United States twice. He died peacefully in a hotel room in Florida at the age of 68. The commission was right. Dewey was untouchable. If Dutch had killed him, the FBI would have burned the Mafia to the ground in 1935. Lucky Luciano went to prison a year later, railroaded by Dewey on prostitution charges. But even from a cell in Dannemora, even later from exile in Italy, Luciano won. His system worked. The commission survived. The families kept earning. The structure he built was durable enough to function without him. Dutch Schultz tried to kill the future with a gun. The future killed him with a vote. The death of Dutch Schultz proved that in the American underworld, the most dangerous weapon isn't a Tommy gun. It isn't a switchblade. It's consensus. It's organization. It's the ability to sit in a room, look a man in the eye, and decide that he is no longer necessary. Luciano turned crime into capitalism. He took the blood out of the streets and put it into the ledger. And any man who couldn't read that ledger, well, they ended up on the bathroom floor of the Palace Chop House. This has been the Untold Mob Chronicles. We don't just tell you who got shot, we tell you why they had to die. If you want to understand the machinery behind the myths, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Was Lucky Luciano a genius for sparing Dewey, or did he betray the code of the outlaw? Until next time, remember, it's not personal, it's just business. Looking back, did killing Dutch actually save the mob, or did it just delay their inevitable fall? If Dutch had killed Dewey, would the Mafia have been destroyed in 1935? This is just one body in a century of bloodshed. Subscribe and turn on notifications.